Brownlee.
Mr Chair, firstly I want to restate that the contents of the government's SOP are put together in a document that was provided to members before the House sat this morning. The process that we've gone through the last couple of days is one that the opposition asked for and the government agreed on. Mr Speaker, I think we're heading towards some regret over that. Because while the information that came through from submitters in many parts was valid and useful, and we have agreed to those things, it did take until the very late hours of this morning, sometime after 4 a.m. I should say, for this particular bit of work to come together. And it needed then some further consideration before it was made available to those who would be drafting the SOP. Throughout the morning, we've heard for the need to get things right and not make mistakes. Well, Mr Speaker, we tabled a bill that we're happy with. But we are, Mr Chair, we are allowing, obviously, those people who have made solid submissions to have their concerns reflected in the finished copy of the bill. But I have to say, sir, it will be about another hour before that SOP is completed. And that is not unreasonable in these circumstances. And the sort of jumping up and down and beating of the chest that we've seen over this is utterly ridiculous in the circumstances. So I have in front of me, Mr Chair, around about at least 100 amendments moved now by the opposition that have been declared valid by the clerk. And I'm going to take the time now to go through those one by one, explaining the government's position over and above the document that was provided to the members of the House this morning. So the first is in the name of the Honourable Ruth Dyson, which deals with an interpretive matter. Mr Speaker, there are 6 changes proposed here. Mr Speaker, to make the process a little shorter, can I simply say that these amendments would extend the powers of the Sarah organisation to a much greater area of Canterbury than is currently the case. The amendments deal with putting the words Canterbury District Health Board into the legislation as one of the bodies that become consulted. Mr Speaker, it is implicit in the legislation that recovery plans for health will be developed with the Canterbury District Health Board. They do not need an additional representation in the bill. Most certainly, the area caught by the bill's provision does not have to be as large as that covered by the Canterbury District Health Board. Similarly, sir, with the issues around the disability strategy, that is a guide for how local authorities should plan for the development of new buildings and facilities in their district, and it will remain so. Mr Speaker, the second one is the proposed amendments from the Honourable Ruth Dyson, moving that there be some exclusions and exceptions of exclusions to appeals. Mr Speaker, the answer to the government's response to this is we won't support this amendment. It puts appeals into the wrong place. If we were to go through this process, then if we would accept this SOP, engaging the Environment Court in the process, that would defeat the purpose of the bill, which is to move swiftly to get good recovery for Canterbury. The next SOP is in the name of the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove and deals with the issue of Part 2, Clause 21, amending by inserting no recovery plan shall be approved without an impact assessment being completed to assess the social, cultural, environmental and community impacts. Mr Speaker, Mr Chair, from our perspective, we believe that this is an enabling framework as a bill, and that would be implicit as a response in some cases for recovery plans. That where there is a need to do something expeditiously, where there is a need to do something, even if it's a temporary arrangement, then this would be an impost that would in fact slow things down, which frankly I think is the intention here today, Mr. Chair. The next one is from the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove to move that in clause 27 amendments be replaced to replacing subclause 7 with the following new subclause. Compensation is payable under the Act for any loss suffered as a result of an action taken under this section. This is where the SERA organisation will have the ability to work with local councils to suspend some aspects of RMA plans. What it would mean, for example, sir, is that airspace currently available to people who own property in Christchurch, excluded from a new CBD plan by the Christchurch City Council, would end up being liable for compensation from the government. That is an unacceptable position, and we will not be supporting that claim, that amendment. Mr. Speaker, the next one talks about an issue of omitting one subsection from 83. The effect of omitting that one subsection without reading what it currently says is that USAR workers who were engaged in the rescue of people. Well, I'll read it then. Shall I read it to the member who clearly herself was not familiar with this particular piece of the legislation? So we go to 83, Mr. Speaker, and we look at subsection 1, which says, which deals with the whole of the thing. He wants to take out subsection 1. So the section itself says every action taken or decision made under the Civil Defence Emergency Act by the National Coordinator, the Director or any person acting under the authority of the National Controller or the Director, if taken or made while the state of civil emergency was in force in respect of Christchurch in 2011, is declared to be and always to have been valid. He wants to take out the bit that says does not apply in respect of any action or decision that is taken or made in bad faith, etc., etc. Well, sir, I think it should apply in those circumstances, and I don't want to see USAR teams suddenly confronted with bills for the damage that may have been done to enter buildings looking for bodies. So we won't be supporting that one, Mr. Speaker. The next one is an amendment in the name of Brendan Burns to move some matters about the Community Forum. Mr. Speaker, the Community Forum will be a subject of some negotiation between, I think, political parties and, of course, the elected representatives. But in the end, it's about giving a voice to people in the community who do not have an elected responsibility, but emerge from those communities as leaders as a result of this particular event. Mr. Speaker, trying to say that there should be more than 6 meetings a year when you've got a bill that's going to run for 5 years fails to understand that at the start of this event, start of this process, there may be need for many more meetings at the front end, but I hope due to the success of the recovery, less at the back end. Mr. Speaker, the next one is also in the name of Brendan Burns, and he wants to move that with regards to the recovery plan for the CBD, in developing the recovery plan for the CBD, the Christchurch City Council must not propose the full or partial sale of any assets which it or any of its subsidiaries hold. So, where does that leave them with the Henderson properties that the Labor Party has spent the last couple of years telling the world were a bunch of dead duck properties that the council should never have invested in? So on the one hand, they're saying they should never have done it, shouldn't have touched it, it was outrageous, but now they're saying don't sell them, they're precious local assets, don't touch them. Mr. Speaker, most of them are busted and broken, and Mr. Speaker, it would be a good thing if the council does have the flexibility to enter property transactions with property held by the ratepayers, particularly when those properties are now a significant burden on an already stressed rating base. Mr. Speaker, the next one is the move by Brendan Burns in committee to move the following amendments: suspension of plan, etc. What Mr. Burns wants to do, Mr. Speaker, is implicit in C of 27. And I'm not going to go into the details of that because it is so obvious that it would be an embarrassment to point it out. Mr Speaker, Mr Burns also wants to move in the committee, Mr Chair,
Jerry Brownlee
wants to move in the committee amendments to the quarterly report on the operation of this Act. He wants clarification for the description to list the instances in which each power was exercised, whether notification and or consultation was required or carried out. Well, Mr Speaker, where there are requirements for disclosure in legislation, there are very few prescriptions about that requirement. We could, for example, disclose MPs' expenses, or should I say ministers' expenses, as a bulk figure, and then let everybody go and work it out. But no one finds that acceptable, so there is a line-by-line attitude taken to it, and it is implicit in this bill that the same process would be followed. Mr Speaker, the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove wants to move that the public notification of the draft recovery plan for the CBD. Mr Speaker, this is one that we will not support, largely because in the end the legislation prescribes that the Minister, therefore the Cabinet Committee and the Cabinet itself, approves that plan. Mr Speaker, the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove also wants to move, with regards to the development of recovery plans, that the process for the development of recovery plan must include one or more public hearings as determined by the Chief Executive, at which members of the public may appear and must be heard. Well, let's say it's a recovery plan for the lower reaches of the Avon as it enters the estuary. We know at the moment that 65% of the 94% of toilets that get flushed in the city don't make their way to the sewerage works. We know that there has to be a suspension of RMA requirements to allow unacceptable discharge into those areas. If there's a better way of doing it, and you can do it quickly, do you really need to have a publicly notified process that allows people to come along and express their view about whether or not you should stop sewerage running into an open waterway? It's an utterly ridiculous suggestion, and we won't be supporting it. Mr Speaker, we have the next is an amendment from the Honourable Ruth Dyson, wanting to amend by omitting sub-clauses, clause 22.2 and inserting the following. Well, for the member, I know that the request will be made in a few minutes. Let me read 22 so that people can be in no doubt about what's in it. I don't want to be accused again of myself not knowing what's in it. It talks about changes to a recovery plan, and it refers to 2, which is action may be taken under subsection 1 using processes the Minister considers appropriate. Ms Dyson wants us to refer back to 11.4 in the bill and to also 5 of the same clause under 22. Mr Speaker, section 11.4 is prescriptive. 22 does not set out that 22.2 sets aside anything. All it does is make sure that there is some flexibility that can be exercised according to the size of the plan that's being dealt with. And once again, it's the Labor Party saying, put in here as many hold it up, slow it down, roadblock arrangements as can possibly be put in place. We then come to amendments by the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove to insert a new 7A relationship with local authorities. And he wants the Minister to meet at least quarterly with the Council, Mayors and Chair of the Regional Council. Mr Speaker, that assumes that there is going to be a massive arm's length lack of collaboration arrangement coming out of this bill. It actually attacks the very, very heart of this bill, which is about having cooperation and collaboration. We won't support that. It would be a matter of bad faith to do so. He also wants to omit from 48, and for those who are uncertain about 48, please turn to the relevant page so that we can be clear about this and not be accused of getting things wrong or going in the wrong place. This is about directions that can be issued by the organisation. So a direction is a simple thing. It could be, would a council mind holding up a decision because there's more information coming, and I can tell you that that's happened in the last few weeks that's been done cooperatively without the need for any reference to any legislation law, but it simply formalised